In 1935, in the middle of the Great Depression, a photographer raised her camera on a crumbling city street and captured a young mother standing on a tenement stoop, her shoulders set, her children gathered close. For almost 90 years, that picture has been printed in textbooks and posters under inspirational captions about strength and resilience. People saw a woman who refused to bend, even as the world collapsed around her. But when the original negative was finally scanned at high resolution and someone zoomed in on the crumpled paper in her hand, restoration revealed 3 words no one had ever noticed before. Notice TO VACATE. And with that, the meaning of the photograph changed. It wasn't just about strength anymore. It was about the exact moment a family learned they were about to lose their home. Most people today know the photograph as Strong Mother, West Side, 1935. It floats around the internet with those easy, shareable lines. She stood tall in the face of hardship. Our grandmothers were tougher than we are. It shows a 30-something woman in a plain dress and worn shoes, hair pinned back, standing on the top step of a narrow stoop. 2 children cling to her skirt, a boy of about 9 and a girl perhaps 6, their faces turned slightly toward her, not toward the camera. Behind them, a doorway yawns dark. Laundry lines sag across the alley. A 3rd child, a toddler, peeks from the window above, barely visible behind grimy glass. At first glance, it looks like the many other photographs shot for Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal agencies in the mid-1930s, a document of poverty meant to shock voters into supporting relief programs. The credit line on the most common reproduction reads, "Photographed by Eleanor Price, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, Chicago, 1935. For decades, that was all anyone seemed to know. No one had a name for the woman. The original glass negative was believed lost. Only soft, contrast-poor prints survived in scrapbooks and agency reports. When curators borrowed the image for exhibits about mothers in the Depression, they focused on her posture, her jawline, the way her body seemed to form a wall between the world and the children behind her. It took a very modern process to bring back the detail that Eleanor Price's lens had seen that day on the west side of Chicago, and with it the name and the story behind the posture. In 2020, the Library of Congress began a project to digitize and restore its entire collection of New Deal photography at the highest resolution possible. Among the boxes of 8x10 negatives sent from an off-site storage facility in Maryland was one that no one had opened in years, labeled only, Price, Chicago Slum, 935, Woman with Children. Archivist and imaging specialist Michael Reyes was the one assigned to scan it. He had spent years zooming into dust-covered glass and brittle cellulose acetate, bringing back cracks in fields, wrinkles on nurses' faces, the names on shop windows in long-demolished streets. To him, this was another day's work. When he lifted the woman with children negative to the light, he recognized the composition instantly. He had seen the poster. A dark figure on a stoop, kids, a leaning lamppost in the background. He had never looked at it long enough to see anything more. He set the negative in the scanner, dialed the resolution up to 4000 dpi, and let the machine run. The first inverted image on his monitor looked much like all the reproductions. Washed-out sky, murky doorway, a woman in a mid-gray dress against a darker brick wall. Then he began to work on it. To understand what he was about to uncover, we need to understand the year that image came from. In 1935, the United States was 6 years into the Great Depression. 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed at the worst point. Even by 35 in cities like Chicago, official joblessness still hovered around 20%. Breadlines snaked around blocks. Men queued outside factories for rumors of work. Women lined up at relief offices to trade rumors of which grocers still gave credit. Roosevelt had been in office 2 years. The first wave of New Deal programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the National Recovery Administration, were already reshaping parts of the economy. But for millions of families, especially in big industrial cities that had boomed in the 1920s, the bleeding didn't stop. Chicago's West Side, where this photo was shot, was a patchwork of worn brick tenements and narrow alleys. Immigrant families from Eastern Europe, black families who had come north during the Great Migration, widows with children, men sleeping 3 to a furnished room, they were all packed into blocks where landlords squeezed every cent they could from subdivided apartments. When relief payments ran late or vanished, when factories cut hours, rent still came due. If you couldn't pay, you received a piece of paper. Notice to vacate. You might get 3 days. You might get 7. If you were lucky and the landlord was soft-hearted or scared of bad publicity, you might get more. But eventually, if you and your neighbors didn't fight back, sheriff's deputies would come to the door. Through 1931 and 1932, Chicago's communist-led unemployed councils had organized literal block-by-block defense against evictions. Groups of women and children would follow bailiffs, drag furniture back into apartments as fast as deputies could haul it out, and sometimes beat the landlord's men back down the stairs. It was a city where eviction was not just a private shame, but a public battle. By 1935, some of the heat had gone out of the rent wars, but the machinery that pushed people out when they couldn't pay remained. Eviction notices still turned up in relief case files, in coroner's reports, in the cheap pine coffins of those who didn't survive winter on the street. That is the world a woman like the one in Eleanor Price's photograph inhabited. Her name, as Price's FARA assignment logs finally revealed, was Ruth Kaplan. She was 32 when the photograph was taken, though the lines at the corners of her mouth and the way she held herself made her look older. She lived at 624 West Polk Street with her 2 children, Daniel and Sarah, in a 3-room apartment on the 2nd floor of a brick building whose roof leaked every time it rained. Ruth had been born in 1903 in Chicago's Maxwell Street district, the oldest child of Polish-Jewish immigrants. Her father worked as a tailor in a sweatshop. Her mother took in boarders and washing. Ruth left school at 14 to help at home, then at 17 married a streetcar conductor named Jacob Kaplan. They moved a few blocks west and a floor higher in the same web of tenements. For a while the 1920s seemed kind. Jacob's wages were steady. They bought used furniture on installments, a radio, a sewing machine. Daniel was born in 1926, Sarah in 1929. Then, in October that same year, the market crashed. By 1931, the streetcar company had slashed routes and fired men. Jacob held on until 1932, then came home one afternoon with his cap in his hands and eyes that wouldn't meet Ruth's. He didn't find another proper job. There were days working on WPA crews clearing snow, weeks helping unload boxcars at the yards, but nothing stable. In the winter of 1933, already thin and coughing for months, he collapsed on a relief line and never got up. The death certificate from Cook County reads, bluntly, pneumonia, chronic malnutrition, age 34. Now Ruth was a widow with 2 small children and no savings. She went back to what she knew, sewing. She found piecemeal work in a garment contractor's loft, paid by the dozen for hemming dresses. 10 cents a garment, 12 if she worked fast. In good weeks she could bring home $6 or $7. The rent on 624 West Polk was $16. At first, the landlord let the arrears slide, especially after the neighborhood relief worker put in a word. But by the summer of 1935, as his own taxes mounted and political winds shifted, his patience ran out. On the morning of September 12, 1935, according to Ruth's case file in the Cook County Relief Administration, she opened her door to find a folded piece of paper wedged between the knob and the jamb. Notice to vacate, it read in heavy type. She had 7 days to leave. It was that folded paper she still had in her hand hours later, when a woman with a camera stepped onto the sidewalk and asked to take her picture. The photographer, Eleanor Price, was 27, a graduate of the Chicago Institute of Design and one of a handful of women hired by the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to document urban poverty. Her assignment list for that week, preserved in the National Archives, includes the line, "Visit West Side case files. Photograph conditions and clients, with permission." Price spent the morning inside tenement hallways and small kitchens, photographing chipped sinks, empty cupboards, shoes with holes. In the early afternoon, she stepped outside 624 West Polk to catch a breath of air and saw Ruth standing on the stoop, children pressed in close, the folded paper clenched in her fist. In Price's own notebook she scribbled, "Mrs. K, widow, 2 children. Eviction notice. I won't cry for them. Stands like stone in front of flat. Take photo?" Ruth agreed, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps thinking that letting this stranger capture her humiliation might help others, somewhere, understand. She didn't smooth her dress. She didn't fix her hair. She just stood on the top step, body between the street and her children, the paper still creased in her hand. Price set up her gray flex on the sidewalk, framed the doorway and the steps, asked Ruth to hold still for a second and pressed the shutter. The negative went into a manila envelope, marked only with date, address and a case file number. The caption that bureaucrats typed later into reports didn't mention an eviction notice. It simply read, "WPA Relief Client, Chicago." By the time the image filtered out to pamphlets and posters, even that was softened. "Strong mother, West Side," some caption writer with a romantic streak added sometime in the 1960s. That line stuck. The original negative, though, kept more than that caption did. When Michael Reyes loaded it into the scanner in 2020, he did what he always did. Adjusted the levels to counteract 85 years of fading, corrected for slight warping, and then began to zoom in. At full frame, the restored image already had more bite than any reproduction he'd seen. You could see the texture of the bricks, the pattern of Ruth's dress, the scuff on Daniel's shoe. Her face in particular looked less like the generic strong mother of posters and more like an individual. One eyebrow a little higher than the other, a mole near the left corner of her mouth, a slightly crooked front tooth. "Let's look closer," he murmured and dragged a rectangle around her hands. In the stereotypes of such images, the mother's hands are usually on the children's shoulders or folded in dignity. Here one hand did rest on Sarah's back. The other, however, was clamped around something square and white, its top edge just peeking out between thumb and fingers. On the grainy prints, it had always looked like nothing more than a handkerchief. Zoomed in at 400% on a crisp scan, it looked very different. The paper was folded into thirds, the top corner bent from repeated handling. On the visible face, in faint, upside-down letters, 3 words marched across the top margin. Notice. Vacate. The ink had bled slightly into the cheap pulp, but the typography was unmistakable. The county sheriff's standard font, the same used in dozens of surviving eviction notices in the archives. Below those words, the part of the text that should have given details, the address, the date, was too obscured by Ruth's fingers to make out. But one number was clear: 624 West Polk. Michael checked and rechecked, manipulated the contrast, inverted the colors to be sure he wasn't seeing patterns and noise. Each adjustment made the letters a little cleaner. "Already we're seeing more than any previous copy," he wrote in his log. Paper previously assumed to be rag or towel clearly visible as official eviction notice held in subject's hand. He pulled back and looked at Ruth's face again, now with that knowledge in mind. Her jaw was not just set in generic determination. The muscles on either side bulged slightly as if she were clenching her teeth. The corners of her mouth were white. Her eyes, instead of being the deep, unknowable shadows of a low-contrast print, were suddenly readable. The lower lid swollen, the whites veined, a faint shimmer at the inner corners. He adjusted the exposure a little more and saw, just beneath her left eye, a faint track of moisture glistening against the grime on her cheek. It caught the light differently from the surrounding skin. A tear she had not had time to wipe away before the shutter clicked. While he was focusing on Ruth, something else changed in the background. Behind her head, to the left, in the doorway's darkness, shapes that had always been pure shadow began to separate. There was the outline of a chair tipped on its side. A pile of bundled cloth. And, on the left edge of the frame, the upper torso of a man in a cap and dark jacket, half turned away, caught mid-motion as he lifted something. A furniture leg, perhaps. "Notice the shadows in the doorway," Michael noted. "Potential movers or deputies present during exposure, partially obscured." He zoomed in further on that slice of the image, enhanced it cautiously, and the form resolved into more specifics. A worn uniform jacket with a badge pinned crookedly to the lapel, the letters D just visible on the round metal. The man's hand grasped the edge of a chest of drawers. The photograph, it turned out, did not show a quiet, generic moment of poverty outside a home. It showed, quite literally, the moment an eviction was underway, deputies inside already lifting furniture, a notice in the mother's hand giving it legal shape, her children pressed against her as the front line between them and the men behind. There was one more person the restoration revealed. Looking again at the upstairs window, Michael brightened the image until the glass blew almost white, then dialed it back. Where a small dark blotch had sat in reproductions, he could now make out the pale oval of a toddler's face. Tiny fingers pressed flat on the glass, eyes just high enough to peer over the sash. His hair, whirled at the crown, was lighter than his siblings. His expression, frozen by chance, was open-mouthed as if crying or calling down. The Fairfield file had noted 3 children under 10 in Ruth's household. The toddler in the window completed the set. With all of these details laid bare, the caption "Strong Mother" felt suddenly dishonest. It wasn't that she wasn't strong. She was. But the image was not about abstract strength. It was about a specific blow being delivered that day on that step. Now that the photograph had been restored, the question was, what happened next to Ruth and her children after the camera was packed away and the notice in her hand went into effect? The Cook County eviction dockets for September 1935 show an entry: Kaplan, Ruth et al., 624 W. Polk, non-payment of rent, order of eviction executed September 1935. Beside it, in pencil, someone had written, "Relief case, CCRA file." The Cook County Relief Administration file, now brittle but legible, recorded that on September 19, deputies removed the furniture, and the family's belongings were placed on the pavement while neighbors watched. Ruth reported that some items were stolen before she could retrieve them. The caseworker's note reads with bureaucratic coldness, "Client highly emotional. Expresses anger at landlord and the city. Children distressed. Emergency shelter arranged at 14th Ward Relief Hotel for 3 nights. Recommend application for federal housing project when available." Those projects under the new Public Works Administration were just beginning. One of the first in Chicago, the Jane Addams houses, would not open until late 1938. For 3 years, Ruth and her children ping-ponged through a series of temporary addresses. Relief rolls list them at a converted warehouse the city used as a family shelter, then at a church basement cot line, then in an overcrowded flat on Maxwell Street shared with another widow and her 4 kids. Daniel missed weeks of school. Sarah, according to a social worker's later note, developed a nervous cough. The toddler, identified in the file as Isaac, was hospitalized twice for bronchitis. Through it all, Ruth continued to sew. She took in mending from neighbors, made shirts for WPA crews when she could get the contract work, and joined a tenants committee trying to pressure the city into building more affordable units. In March 1938, an internal memo in the Chicago Housing Authority file reads, "Recommend priority placement for family of Mrs. R. Kaplan, widow, 3 children, due to long-term displacement and good standing with relief agency." That summer, Ruth and her children moved into an apartment at the brand-new Jane Addams houses, with indoor plumbing and steam heat for $22 a month, most of it covered by rent assistance. In a brief oral history recorded in 1974, Sarah, by then an adult named Sarah Kaplan Rosen, remembered that move vividly. "I was 9, she said. The day they gave us the key, my mother took us up the stairs and opened the door, and there was nothing inside but clean white walls. No bugs, no cracks. She put her hand on the radiator and started crying. We didn't have much stuff anymore, not after being thrown out so many times, but she said, 'These walls will hold.'" The interviewer asked her if she remembered the eviction in 1935. "I remember men in our house," she said slowly. "I remember being on the steps with my face in her dress and hearing drawers slam. I remember my little brother screaming at the window, but they wouldn't let her go get him until they finished whatever papers they had to sign." When shown a small reproduction of the Price photograph, long before the restoration, she recognized it immediately. "That's my mother," she said. "She didn't like that picture much. She said they made her look like a statue. But I think she agreed to it because she wanted someone to see what they were doing to us." Sarah kept a copy of it in a box with other family documents. Jacob's death certificate, Ruth's naturalization papers, school reports, rent receipts. Before she died in 2010, she donated that box to the Chicago History Museum, which is how it ended up, eventually, in the hands of the Library of Congress project. Ruth herself lived to see her children grow up and scatter. A 1959 obituary in the Chicago Daily News for Mrs. Ruth Kaplan, age 56, beloved mother of Daniel, Sarah, and the late Isaac, mentions only that she was active in tenants' rights and community sewing circles. It says nothing about the day on the stoop or the piece of paper in her hand. Isaac, the toddler in the window, did not make it to adulthood. Hospital records show he died of pneumonia in 1943, aged 9, in a crowded ward that was itself full of children from damp, underheated buildings. 4 years, the photograph's journey through time followed the same path as so many others from that era. It was reproduced in FARA and later WPA reports on urban housing. It was used in a 1940 pamphlet urging Congress to fund more public housing with the caption, "Millions of mothers fight for decent homes." In the 1970s, when nostalgia for the Roosevelt years bloomed, it was reprinted in coffee table books with captions that emphasized courage, not conflict. Not once in those captions did the words, "eviction notice" appear. Michael's restoration, and the visibility of those 3 words on the folded paper, changed that. The Library of Congress updated its online catalog entry to include Ruth's name and the full context drawn from the Cook County records. The old caption, "Strong Mother, West Side, 1935, was replaced with, "Mrs. Ruth Kaplan stands on the stoop of 624 West Polk Street, Chicago, September 12, 1935, holding an eviction notice served that morning, as sheriff's deputies remove furniture from her apartment behind her." Photographed by Eleanor Price for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. When Sarah's daughter, Ruth's granddaughter Miriam, learned of the restoration, she asked to see the high-resolution file. She had grown up with a small framed copy of the photograph on a hallway wall, one her mother had captioned in ballpoint on the back, "Bub on Polk Street before they threw us out." The details had blurred in Miriam's mind. The photo was just part of the family landscape, like a religious icon of endurance. Sitting in front of a monitor at the museum, she saw for the first time the text on the paper her grandmother clutched, the tear on her cheek, the deputy in the doorway, the toddler's desperate face at the window. "I always knew the story," she said quietly. "I never saw it written on her like that." She thought for a long moment. "I like that people saw her as strong," she added. She was. But I'm glad they'll know now what she was standing up against. Not just hard times in some vague way, but a landlord and a sheriff and a whole system that would throw a widow and 3 kids on the street. The restored photograph now hangs in a climate-controlled gallery as part of an exhibit on housing and justice. Visitors stop in front of it, read the caption, and then, more often than not, lean in to see the paper in Ruth's hand. Once you've noticed the words "Notice to Vacate," it's hard not to see them first. The image that for so long was used as a generic symbol of strong motherhood has become something sharper. A document of a specific injustice, and a reminder that even the most famous photographs rarely tell their full story at first glance. Stories like this remind us that the past isn't just about distant dates and impersonal forces. It lives in scraps of paper clutched in tired hands, in the tense line of a jaw, in a child's eyes behind dirty glass. It lives in the moments when everyday people are pushed to a brink they did nothing to choose. When we restore these images, when we zoom in, clean away the dust, and read the words that were always there, we're not just improving the resolution. We're restoring accountability. We're giving names and reasons back to faces that had been flattened into symbols. And we're reminded that behind every strong pose there is often a blow that made strength necessary in the first place. If you want to keep looking past the surface of old photographs, to learn the difficult truths that sit in the shadows and the folded papers, you're in the right place. There are thousands more images waiting in boxes and hard drives, each with its own Ruth, its own Luke, its own moment on a stoop or under a tree when someone thought they were just making a picture and instead left behind evidence. We'll keep bringing those stories up out of the dark. Stay curious about the darkness,